Hello and welcome to GCSE Chemistry tutorial for topic C2 Bonding, Structure and Properties of Matter. This tutorial will cover part 2 Ionic compounds. Starting off with just some key terms. Ionic bonding involves gaining or losing electrons, and it occurs between metals and non-metals where they form positive and negative ions. There is also other kinds of bonding which we will look at in other tutorials. Covalent bonding involves sharing electrons, and that's between nonmetals, and metallic bonding involves delocalized or free electrons, and that occurs in metals and in alloys. Let's go back to ionic bonding. First of all, what are ions? Well, ions are formed when an atom loses or gains electrons. If you remember, an atom loses or gains electrons in order to become full. Metals always lose electrons. Because electrons have a negative charge, if you lose electrons, then the atom becomes positive. Non-metals gain electrons, and so they become negative. Look at the example here. Here's sodium 281. That's a sodium atom. When the sodium atom loses one electron, it becomes a sodium ion, and it has a positive charge because it's lost one electron. If you look at oxygen, oxygen is 2,6, so it needs to gain 2 electrons to become full. So because it's gained 2, it's 2 negative. That's an oxide ion. Ionic bonding occurs when non-metals and metals lose and gain electrons. When they do this, they become positive and negative. And then positive and negative ions attract each other. Opposite charges attract. And when they do that, they form ionic compounds. The force of attraction between positive and negative is called an electrostatic bond. A really common example of ionic bonding is sodium chloride. If you look at this picture here, you have sodium with 1 electron in its outer shell, and you have chlorine with 7 in its outer shell. So what happens is chlorine gains an electron from sodium. So sodium loses an electron and gives it to chlorine. By sodium losing an electron, it becomes positive. By chlorine gaining 1 electron, it becomes negative. These positive and negative ions then join together to form sodium chloride, or NaCl. Here's some other examples of ionic bonding. This is magnesium oxide. What's happened here is magnesium has given 2 of its electrons to oxygen. So oxygen is now full. Because oxygen's gained 2, it says 2 negative, and because magnesium has lost 2, it's 2 positive. Another example is calcium chloride. This one's slightly different. Calcium loses 2 electrons to become full, but it needs to give those 2 electrons to 2 different chloride ions. So 1 chlorine ion here, 1 chloride ion here. And as you can see, the formula for this would therefore be CaCl2, because there's 1 calcium and 2 chlorides. So what about the properties of ionic compounds? When they all join together, there's a repeated positive and negative ions that make up a giant ionic 3D lattice as shown. And there's really strong forces between the positive and negative. Remember, they're called electrostatic forces. Because the forces are so strong, ionic compounds have a high melting and boiling point. They also conduct electricity when they're melted or mixed with water in a solution. And that's because when they're melted and in solution, they're a liquid. And so the ions can move and are free to carry electric charge. So ionic compounds don't conduct electricity when they're solid, but they do when they're a liquid. They can be dissolved in water, and they're most commonly found as brittle salts. So sodium chloride is an example, and that's a salt that you would use and put on your chips, etc. But there's lots of other types of salts as well. If you pause the tutorial and try and answer the questions, give yourself 10 minutes. What ion is formed from a chlorine atom? Well, chlorine, if you draw it out, is 287. So it needs to gain one electron. If it gains one electron, it becomes a chloride ion, which is Cl-. How does magnesium and oxygen bond? If you look at the diagram, magnesium gives 2 electrons to oxygen. So magnesium becomes Mg2+, because it's lost 2 electrons. And oxygen becomes O2-, or an oxide ion, because it's gained 2 electrons. The positive and negative then join together to form magnesium oxide, or MgO. Why do ionic compounds have a high melting and boiling point? Because of the electrostatic forces between the positive and negative ions. Because those forces are so strong, they need a lot of energy to break, and so a high temperature is needed to break that bond. In summary, we've looked at ionic compounds.